Hi, this is Margo. This is Wednesday, May the 16th, 2018, and today I'm continuing with our series of Immanuel Velikovsky's book, Mankind in Amnesia. I encourage you to listen to part 1, where I did quite an extensive background and introduction on who Immanuel Velikovsky was. And this is part 2, and I'm reading the book that he wrote called Mankind in Amnesia. I'm going to get right into it today. I'm starting with Chapter 1 of Racial Memory, an Amnesia Victim. A victim of amnesia may live adjacent to neighbors who are completely unaware of his plight. He may be employed, he may be married, he may behave on the surface like anybody else, but he has forgotten everything before a certain date. He does not know his name, and he assumes a new name to hide his own perplexity. He does not remember his childhood and adolescence or maturity prior to that date. He does not know the town or city from which he came, and how he got to his new habitat. He does not know whether he was married formally, nor whether he has children. If he comes into conflict with the law, as for instance for bigamy, he may wind up in a psychiatric clinic. In most cases, victims of amnesia voluntarily seek psychiatric help. Amnesia need not erase all memory. It may affect only certain areas of the past. Such cases are very numerous, and rarely is a neurotic personality free from some area of oblivion. Characteristically, the oblivion erases the most painful or terrorizing reminiscences. Psychoanalysis, as Sigmund Freud conceived it, is a tool for bringing into the conscious mind the memories that have sunk into the subconscious stratum of the mind. This dredging up of a partial amnesia, if successful, is destined to heal the person of his irrational behavior. Irrational or pathological reactions and pursuits are symptoms of a neurosis. In the early days, psychoanalysis was called catharsis by Freud, because by getting a sick person once again to live through a painful scene, Freud was able to restore the mental health of the patient and free him or her from pathological reactions. Freud's very first patient was a young lady who became the victim of a paralyzing neurosis upon having submerged, as Freud found, the most painful memory of the circumstances of the death of her father, whom she had nursed. Another of the pathological forms to which an amnesia may lead is what is called mental scotoma. In ophthalmology, scotoma is a partial or insular blindness. A certain segment of the field of vision does not register on the retina because of some defect, like detachment of the retina or a clot of blood beneath it. Psychological scotoma is an inability to observe certain phenomena or to recognize certain situations, though they are obvious to other persons. A man may not see an evident fact or not recognize an obvious situation, though his intelligence and rationality should produce an immediate realization and proper reaction. The proverbial husband of the promiscuous wife is the only one with no suspicion whatsoever. Psychologically, most probably, the husband's unawareness of such a situation is conditioned by suppressed homosexuality, producing a blindness to the state of affairs. Whereas the phenomenon of total amnesia is rare, the observance of partial amnesia, or psychological scotoma, are daily experiences in psychiatry and psychoanalysis, and the reader himself most probably has succeeded in erasing from the conscious memory some painful occurrences, greater or smaller, that his ego cannot face. Much of maladjustment, failure and floundering, guilt feeling and self-punishment, or aggressiveness, hatred and hostility, pathological inclinations and sexual aberrations, criminal impulses and acts, suicide and murder, or detachment from reality and flight into madness can be traced by correctly applied analytical procedure to impressions erased from the conscious memory. Traumatic occurrences obliterated, in short, to contents submerged. From the mind's dark recesses, they pilot the personality toward its bizarre behavior, and, not seldom, toward a repetition of the traumatic experience. This repetition is sought in the form of a return to the scene of the first experience, or in a fixation on abnormal sexual objects, or in selection of an occupation offering a regular substitute for an act repressed from the conscious memory. In Beyond the Pleasure Principle, published in 1920, as also in several others of his works, Freud developed the thesis that the patient cannot recollect everything he repressed, and quite possibly the most important part of it stays repressed. He is, however, urged to repeat the repressed instead of recollecting it. Freud spoke of this compulsion for repeating as of demoniac quality. The one possessed by it lives in a dark anxiety, afraid of awakening something that would be better left asleep. Mind's frontiers. The mind is the least known territory, though through it man has obtained the entire sum of his experience and knowledge. Tests are made, IQs evaluated, psychological theories are written, psychotherapies are practiced, the action of drugs on the sensorium and behavior are studied, sex hormones are explored, the inner secretions of the pituitary gland are examined, brains are dissected, experiments on animals are made, and many discoveries are registered. But after all the efforts, some cardinal issues are as much in darkness now as they were thousands of years ago. Are all the facilities of the brain subject to tests and evaluation? What is the thinking process? Does a person have a soul as well as a mind? Where is its seat? Certainly it is not in the heart, though common expression makes of the heart a seat of the emotions. A damage to a part of the brain, as in arteriosclerosis, or in a massive shock may lead to an irreparable loss of memory. Does the soul thus perish? And does it die fully when the individual dies? Does the soul have communion with unknown forces? Does it survive the body? Theology and spiritualism tear at the problem with little evidence and unproven results. A probe touching a cell in the brain makes a forgotten memory vivid, so vivid that the person believes himself to be living in a situation that actually took place many years before. We have seen a person susceptible to hypnosis receive an oral order to be unable to see or to hear or to move an arm or comply with the order. Is this just a pretense on the subject's part? But the same person receives an order to be like a rigid rod and, upon being placed between two chairs, head on one and heels on the edge of the other, he or she, even a slight woman, in this cataleptic state, can support the weight of several persons. Whence comes this physical reserve, unavailable in the conscious life to the persons now in catalepsy? And how can an oral order, nothing but sound, mobilize this reserve? A person in hypnosis is given a suggestion to perform some act at a given time, possibly days after the hypnotic session, and to forget the command until time for its execution. Without being consciously aware of the suggestion and without a timepiece, the individual executes the command precisely on time. Is it, then, that a time-measuring device is implanted in the human brain? What causes forgetting and remembering? Least of all, does the hypnotist, be he a trained psychiatrist or an uneducated variety performer, know what makes hypnosis work? What are the physical and mental reserves that can be brought into action with the simplest of tools, a human word or gesture? The limits are suddenly so much wider that the capabilities used in daily life seem but one octave of a full keyboard. At postdoctorate courses in medicine that I attended in the early 20s in Berlin, we were given a chance to examine a 10-year-old mentally retarded boy who could, with almost the speed of a computer, then not yet in existence, tell the day in the week of any date, such as the birthdays of the participants in the course. If such capacity is present in one, what makes it unattainable in others? Dervishes in an auto-hypnotic state walk on burning coals and suffer no ill effect. Skin can be cut, and blood ordered not to flow. A person in a trance can reportedly speak a language that he or she never heard or even learned. All this was known and practiced since very early times. To speak with other tongues, as in Acts 2:4. To be made temporarily blind, as in Genesis 19:11. And in the second book of Kings 6:18. Sanvarim, in my understanding, being the term for hypnosis in biblical Hebrew. Extrasensory perception is a field explored and debated by the credulous and by the skeptical. Sides are taken as if it were a matter of conviction and not of knowledge. The experiments at Duke University in North Carolina suffer from neglect of attention to the emotional state of the sender as well as of the recipient, as if such a state had no influence on the transmission of thoughts or messages from one individual to another. So much deception, voluntary or involuntary, has been introduced into the field of spiritualism, with materialization or ectoplasm, automatic writing, telekinesis, etc., that though necromancy is at least as old as the story of the witch of Endor, 1 Samuel 28:7, nothing can be claimed with assurance for the credit or debit side of the ledger. This is true even though that such a clear thinker as the physicist Oliver Lodge, or such a wizard of detective invention as Arthur Conan Doyle, sided with what must be termed the miraculous. A feeling persists that though mental processes are physiological, and therefore, in the last analysis, physical and chemical, there are screens in man himself that hide from him a large part of the house he calls soul, this being the sum of all mind's activities, past and present, and all perception received or inherited, and that may or may not transcend the barriers of time, a metaphysical entity itself. Collective unconscious mind. In 1930, I spent the summer on a working vacation in Zurich. During the preceding winter, I had written a paper, quote, on the physical existence of the world of thought, unquote. In Küsnacht, near Zurich, I visited Professor Eugene Bleuler, for decades the undisputed dean of psychiatry. It was Bleuler who opened the doors of academia to Sigmund Freud by assigning his assistant Carl Jung at Berkholzli Mental Hospital to study Freudian theory with a view to its application in the wards. Bleuler and Freud both were born in 1856. But while Freud was a loner, rejected, and hardly ever mentioned in medical periodicals unless in disrepute, Bleuler dominated the field. In that paper of mine, I dealt with certain problems near the borderline of the then legitimate psychiatry. I claimed that physical processes underlie mental processes. I maintained that it should be possible to make the blind see and the deaf hear by reaching the brain centers with adequate electrical impulses, thus circumventing the peripheral sensorial organs. I postulated engrams in brain cells as carriers of memory, and it followed the engrams could be reawakened by suitable mechanical impulses. I maintained that encephalograms of persons suffering from epilepsy would show a disorderly and violent wave pattern as if caused by short circuits, until then only one paper on the encephalogram in men, and that in healthy men had been published by Hans Berger of Jena. I wrote, quote, at an excitation of a peripheral sense organ, for instance, an eye by a strong light, there appears a current oscillation in the opposite optical region. I think it would be worthwhile to apply the experiments of Berger on epileptics. The lightning start of an epileptic seizure reminds me strongly of the action of a short circuit. Then it would be proper also to experiment with the possibility of relieving the too strong oscillations of the current in the brain of the epileptics. This should be regarded as a preliminary communication." Unquote. I also claimed the existence of a collective mind in the early stages of the development of the species. Individualization accompanies the evolution from lower to higher forms, yet the collective mind is never fully erased in man. It comes to the fore preferably in excited states of mind, also in crowds swept by emotions. On this score I wrote, quote, "It transpires ever clearer that the autonomy of the mental domains of separate individuals must have developed as a more complicated and higher state in the origin of the species. In our concept, telepathy is an archaic form of thought transmission. The more a species is developed, the more is the single creature separated as a thinking ego from the world around it. The migration of the young birds that fly toward the homeland of their parents, the collective work of ants and bees, which understand how to execute a great work following a common pattern, and similar examples speak for a not too sharp division of the mental life of one animal from that of the others. This archaic form of reciprocal influence shows itself in the animal herd and also in the human herd, the mass." Unquote. Bleuler discussed my paper with me and willingly acceded to my desire that he should write an introduction to it. In his introduction, Bleuler said, quote, "Out of a mass of superstition, illusion, and deceit, facts were retrieved for which the so-called natural explanations failed completely. These facts are numerous enough to compel science to make them the object of a very careful study. Therefore, an attempt to bring them into correlation with known natural laws is very useful. It can not only stimulate scientific thought, but also help to overcome the fear incompatible with science of entering a new and very unusual domain. The ideas of the author appear to me very much worthy of consideration. I myself came upon very similar, in essential aspects quite identical concepts, even if I cannot subscribe to every detail. If the work of Dr. V contributes only so much that one would be able to speak about these matters without being thought crazy or, at the least, inferior, it already serves science, independently of how much of its content will stand future research." Unquote. Upon my return to Mount Carmel, near Haifa, where I then lived and practiced, I sent the paper to Europe for publication in some journal dedicated to psychiatric research. After one rejection, the name of Bleuler prevailed, and the prestigious Zeitschrift für die gesamte Neurologie und Psychiatrie published it in 1931. I sent a copy of the printed article to Freud, who answered as usual in longhand. His letter reads: June 24th, 1931. Dear colleague, I find myself in complete agreement with Bleuler on the contents of your paper. I, too, have independently formed my own opinions on the subject, which come very close to yours, and which in some parts quite coincide with them. It is exactly the analyst who has the least objection to an energetic interpretation of the processes of thought. My own experiences have led me to suppose that telepathy is the real core of the alleged parapsychological phenomena, and may be the only one. But in these matters I have neither experienced anything compelling, nor have I found it anywhere else, not even in your paper. Therefore nothing remains to us but to await clarification of this basically physical problem from the hopefully not too distant future. With friendly greetings, your Freud. The understanding of the collective unconscious mind may explain many phenomena observed in social animals, like ants and bees, working on a common plan. Anybody who has observed the behavior of large shoals of fish, numbering in the thousands, changing instantaneously and simultaneously the direction of their swim, finds it difficult to explain the simultaneity of action in mimicry. It appears more plausible that the fish act as they do by impulses of a common mind, the collective mind of a crowd, all members of which are reacting identically to a given impulse. The question then arises whether a collective mind is a product merely of some process akin to telepathy, or whether it may also link consecutive generations. This is a highly important problem bearing on nothing less than the ultimate fate of the human race, and with it on the rest of the population of the planet. I'm going to stop there for today. So what he's talking about is, how people can be so part of the same mind in the masses, and I believe that the elite already know the answer to all of this. They know the secrets of the mind and the consciousness and the unconscious, and they use it, and it's called mind control. And this is where we're going with all of this. So I hope you enjoyed our show for today. My name is Margo. I'm a hypnotist, holistic life coach, and empathic spiritual healer. My website is margoshealingcorner.com. And until next time, go in peace and God bless. Goodbye.